The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty floorboards. Julian knelt, his breath coming in ragged pants as he worked. He muttered under his breath about how much longer this would take, certain his arms were about to fall off. From his chair, Wyatt's eyes, which had been smoldering with a low fire, snapped open. He questioned if this was all Julian could handle, wondering aloud if the thin oatmeal he'd been fed was a complete waste. With a dismissive flick, he knocked Julian's hand away from the boot he was polishing and took over the task himself. Julian flexed his aching fingers, his expression a mask of misery. He silently cursed whatever twist of fate had brought him to this point. His name was Julian Vance, once the pampered youngest son of a New York banking family. A night of ill-advised revelry to celebrate his 20th birthday had ended with a catastrophic tumble. And he had woken up here, in the midst of the Great Depression, inhabiting the body of a notoriously lazy local boy. The clapboard house was barren, the pantry so empty that even mice wouldn't bother to visit. For 2 decades, his only real skill had been spending his father's money. When it came to practical abilities, he was utterly useless. He knew a boy like him wouldn't last long in a world where people were fighting for scraps. Just as starvation seemed imminent, the Miller family, the town butchers, took him in for a single silver dollar. The good news was that he would eat. The bad news was that he was expected to be a companion to both of their sons. The worst news was that neither of them wanted him. The elder brother, Caleb, was still devoted to the memory of Leo, a boy their family had fostered years ago. He had never offered Julian a kind word or a gentle touch. Julian was privately relieved. The younger brother, Wyatt, found Julian's slender frame unappealing compared to a woman's curves, and he frequently complained that Julian was a useless mouth to feed. He only ever sought Julian out when his baser urges became too much to ignore, pulling him into crude, one-sided encounters. To Julian, who had grown up in boarding schools, it was hardly scandalous. As long as his ultimate virtue remained intact, he could endure it. Wyatt let out a low groan, and through the haze of his own discomfort, Julian heard his name spoken in a rough whisper. He looked over, startled, but Wyatt's expression was unreadable, as if the sound had been a figment of Julian's imagination. Then Julian's eyes fell upon the object in Wyatt's hands. It was a pair of his own worn-out long johns from the mending pile. A hot flush crept up his neck, and he stammered, unable to form a complete sentence about why Wyatt had them. He'd always thought Wyatt was a straightforward man, someone who resented him for being a poor substitute for a woman. Julian unconsciously pulled his thin shirt tighter around himself and shifted away. Wyatt noticed the movement and shot him a contemptuous look. He told Julian not to pretend to be shy, reminding him that he had come into their home to serve both him and his brother. He then warned Julian not to waste his efforts on Caleb, whose heart belonged only to Leo. Wyatt added that if Julian was truly desperate, he could help, but not to get any ideas. He claimed his only reason for touching Julian was to get his dollar's worth. With that, he turned his head, a faint unease in his features. Julian was bewildered by the suggestion that he was putting in any effort at all. His only goal was to eat their food. Suddenly, a loud banging rattled the front door. Caleb's voice, tight with anger, called out, asking what time it was and if any work was going to get done that day. The Millers made their living as butchers, a trade that, even in these hard times, was more prosperous than scratching a living from the parched earth. Caleb had been sharpening blades in the yard since dawn, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone growing steadily more frantic. When Julian emerged from the room, Caleb slammed a cleaver into a wooden stump, making him flinch. If Julian hadn't known Caleb was preparing for the day's work, He might have thought the man was about to butcher him to save on groceries. Caleb demanded to know why he was lazing about indoors in the middle of the day. There was a controlled fury in his voice. Julian wanted to explain that it was Wyatt who had kept him. But one look at the cleaver and Caleb's powerful fists convinced him to hold his tongue. He simply stated that he understood and it wouldn't happen again. Seeing his compliance, Caleb's expression softened slightly. He informed Julian that breakfast was on the table and that he was to go cut feed for the pigs afterward. As Julian turned to leave, Caleb called him back. His face suddenly hardened again, his eyes fixed on the shirt Julian was wearing. He asked who had given him permission to wear it. Julian looked down at the faded blue flannel. Their mother, Ma Miller, had given it to him the day before. He realized with a sinking feeling it must have been Leo's. He had to suppress a weary sigh. He wouldn't be feigning to be a replacement for some long-gone boy if it weren't for the promise of a meal. Leo had been taken in by the Millers, but his birth parents had found him and taken him back the previous year. Ma Miller, sensing her eldest son's lingering heartache, had brought Julian home, noting his vague resemblance to the other boy, hoping he might serve as a stand-in. Caleb's anger was palpable. He ordered Julian to take it off, and before Julian could react, Caleb's hand shot out, his fingers digging into Julian's shoulder like steel talons. The grip felt like it would shatter the bone, and tears of pain welled in Julian's eyes. A wave of self-pity washed over him. He had never suffered such an indignity in his life. Back in New York, his parents and older brothers had doted on him, ready to give him the moon if he asked. Now he was being brutalized over a scrap of old cloth for the sake of a meal. He just wanted to go home. Caleb seemed to hesitate for a moment, his grip slackening, but his voice was still firm as he repeated his demand. Wyatt emerged from the room then, saw the scene, and quickly crossed the yard. He grabbed Caleb's arm, reasoning with his brother that it was pointless. The shirt was already worn, he argued, and Leo wouldn't want it back now anyway. Caleb released his hold, and Julian stumbled back, landing hard on the dusty ground. It wasn't the first time Caleb had lashed out at him over something related to Leo. It was becoming clear that his position in the Miller household was untenable. The brothers' resentment would surely lead to him being thrown out sooner or later. Fortunately, he had a backup plan. He had a third benefactor. His other arrangement was with Silas, a hunter who lived at the edge of the woods. Silas was handsome, capable, and generous. The only drawback was his name, which sounded jarringly similar to someone Julian had once despised. Life with the Millers was a grim affair of thin oatmeal and dandelion greens. After a month, Julian felt as if the bitterness of weeds was flowing through his veins. One day, deep in the woods, faint with hunger, he smelled roasting meat. Ahead, a powerfully built man sat beneath an oak tree, eating. It was a thick piece of roasted rabbit. At the Millers, any good meat was sold to the wealthy families in town. The family ate the offal, and even that was reserved for Ma Miller's sons. Julian, the purchased commodity, was not entitled to a share. He swallowed hard but didn't dare approach. From that day on, however, his attention was fixed on Silas. Whenever he could, he would slip away to the woods and follow the hunter from a distance. The sight of Silas, strong and self-sufficient, was almost as good as the food he imagined him eating. Silas appeared beside him as if from nowhere, pinning him against the trunk of a tree. His muscular forearm pressed against Julian's throat, and his lean, hard body held him fast. The hunter's rugged face was dark with suspicion as he demanded to know why Julian was following him. The reason was simple. The smell of cooked meat clinging to Silas was intoxicating. For a boy ruled by his stomach, desire overrode fear. Forgetting his predicament, Julian lunged forward and licked a stray crumb of meat from the corner of Silas's mouth. It was delicious. Silas, shocked, pushed him away so hard he stumbled. He failed to notice the deep red flush that crept up the hunter's ears. Driven by a desperate hunger, Julian blurted out the question of whether Silas needed help around his cabin. He knew Silas was aware of his arrangement with the Millers. It was a bold and shameless proposition. Silas stared, momentarily speechless, his own face now burning. Julian felt a sting of humiliation and, assuming the offer was rejected, turned to leave, casting one last, longing glance at the satchel of food at Silas's belt. But Silas grabbed his arm, his voice a low growl. Yes, that day Silas shared his rabbit with Julian. It was the best thing Julian had ever tasted, perfectly cooked despite the lack of salt or seasoning. He nearly wept with gratitude. As they parted, Silas pressed a silver dollar into his hand, gruffly stating that he could provide whatever the Millers could. Julian had no room of his own at the butcher's house. Since Caleb had thrown him out of Leo's old room, he alternated between the brothers' beds. Tonight was Caleb's turn. After dinner, he went to the small room and climbed into bed early. Knowing Caleb's distaste for him, he remained silent, wrapping himself tightly in the thin blanket and pretending to sleep. But the throbbing pain in his shoulder made rest impossible. He was a pauper with no means to see a doctor or buy medicine. He could only endure it, silently cursing Caleb in his mind. He heard a rustling sound beside the bed. A moment later, the blanket was pulled back, and Caleb began to tug at his shirt. Julian sat up in alarm, clutching the fabric. Caleb's voice was a low murmur, telling him not to move. In his hand, Caleb held a small jar of liniment. It was a rare gesture, one that suggested he remembered inflicting the injury. The bruise on Julian's shoulder was a terrifying mix of blue and purple. The slightest touch sent a jolt of agony through him, and he couldn't suppress a hiss of pain. Caleb's hand paused, the pressure of his fingers gentling almost imperceptibly. He remarked with disdain that Julian was more delicate than Leo had ever been. Julian thought it was audacious for Caleb to comment on his sensitivity when he was the one who had caused the injury, but he held his tongue. He chose to treat the comment as the meaningless barking of a dog. Once the soothing ointment was applied, the burning sensation faded, and he quickly drifted towards sleep. He was jolted awake by the feeling of a warm, solid chest pressing against his back. His drowsiness vanished. He immediately shifted away, trying to create as much space as possible. But the body behind him moved closer. He shifted again. The body followed. After several rounds of this, with Julian nearly pressed against the cold wall, Caleb seized his arm. His voice was laced with resentment as he asked if being touched by him was so repulsive. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, Julian could see the fury on Caleb's face. He replied stiffly that he simply didn't want to be thrown outside in the cold. Once, when he had accidentally brushed against Caleb in his sleep, Caleb had flown into a rage and forced him out of the house to be eaten alive by mosquitoes all night. At his words, Caleb's body went rigid. He angrily flung Julian's arm away, demanding to know why he was still holding on to something that had happened so long ago. Julian's hand slammed against the wooden headboard with a dull thud, and fresh tears of pain sprang to his eyes. He didn't understand this man's volatile nature. He wasn't the one holding a grudge. It seemed a peaceful night's sleep was impossible. He decided he would rather be outside. He could sneak into Wyatt's room later. Wyatt, for all his crudeness, had never thrown him out in the middle of the night. But as he swung one leg out of the bed, Caleb's dark gaze fell upon him. He asked what Julian was doing. When Julian explained he was leaving on his own accord, Caleb's face turned into a thunderous mask. He stared at Julian with a hateful intensity and snarled a guess that he was running off to Wyatt. For a fleeting second, Julian thought he saw a flash of hurt in Caleb's eyes, but he quickly dismissed it as a trick of the light. Caleb must have remembered the last time he'd locked Julian out for accidentally breaking one of Leo's old wood carvings. That night, Julian had crept into Wyatt's room for shelter. When Caleb had a change of heart and opened the door to find him gone, he had been furious. He hadn't spoken to Julian for 2 weeks after that, but he had never locked him out again. Now, Caleb's voice was a furious, guttural command. "Don't go. Sleep." He then rolled over, turning his back to Julian and lying perfectly still. Julian sighed silently at the man's capricious temper and pulled his leg back into the bed. Caleb remained angry, ignoring Julian for days. Julian didn't mind. He preferred the silence. The problem was that whenever he angered the brothers, Ma Miller would reduce his rations. That morning, she gave him no breakfast at all, instead setting him to the task of churning butter in the yard. He worked the churn with a listless rhythm, his eyes fixed on the road. He was waiting for the Miller brothers to leave for town with their deliveries. Then he could sneak away to see Silas. He hadn't seen him in days, and he found himself missing him, or at least, missing the food Silas cooked. Wyatt appeared and snatched the churn handle from his grip, complaining that at this rate, he'd be at it all day without producing any butter. Julian, too weak from hunger to argue, turned his face away, hoping Wyatt would just leave and not delay his escape. Instead, Wyatt grabbed him and pulled him forcefully into the house. Julian's first thought was that Wyatt wanted to use him again. His wrist, still sore from where Caleb had bruised it, throbbed in protest. He couldn't do it today, he had no energy. He quickly hid his hands behind his back. But Wyatt reached into his shirt and pulled out 2 hard-boiled eggs. He grabbed Julian's arm and pressed them into his hand, looking away as he gruffly told him to eat, so he didn't starve. Julian was momentarily stunned. Eggs were a luxury, sold for cash to buy flour and other necessities. He'd only seen them on the Miller's table once, at Christmas, and he hadn't been given any. He remembered watching the family eat, and Wyatt, noticing his longing gaze, had secretly slipped a piece onto his plate while his mother wasn't looking. Now, looking at the precious eggs in his hand, Julian's mouth watered. He wasn't one to refuse a gift. He devoured them in seconds, but 2 eggs did little to quell the gnawing hunger in his stomach. He licked his lips, wishing for more. When he looked up, he saw Wyatt staring at him, his eyes strangely intense, his face flushed. The look was predatory, like a wolf watching its prey. Julian took a step back, muttering that he should get back to the butter. Before he could finish, Wyatt lunged, pulling him into a rough embrace. His voice was hoarse as he whispered Julian's name, asking for just a moment. Julian felt something hard press against his backside and froze, his body rigid with apprehension. The door creaked open, and both he and Wyatt jumped. Caleb stood in the doorway, his face a mask of rage. He strode forward and threw a punch that sent Wyatt stumbling back. Julian wanted to speak, but the ferocity in Caleb's expression kept him silent. Caleb shoved Julian out into the yard, leaving the 2 brothers alone in the room. The house's thin walls did little to muffle their argument. Julian could hear everything clearly. To his astonishment, Caleb and Wyatt were fighting over him. Caleb grabbed Wyatt by the collar, his voice low and threatening, reminding him that he had told him not to touch Julian. Wyatt, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip, looked not surprised but scornful. He asked Caleb if Leo would approve of how much he cared. At the mention of Leo's name, Caleb faltered. The anger on his face collapsed into something more like shame and frustration. He told Wyatt to stay out of his business. But Wyatt laughed, reminding his brother that Julian didn't belong to him alone. The words seemed to strike a nerve. Caleb's face grew darker, and he attacked Wyatt again, his punches wild and brutal. Wyatt fought back just as fiercely. The fight was only broken up when Ma Miller returned. Seeing the bruises and cuts on her sons, her face filled with pain. She couldn't bring herself to blame her own children, so all her anger was directed at Julian. That evening, she summoned him. She sat in her rocking chair and pointed to a large basin of dried beans on the floor. She told him that sorting beans brought peace, and since there had been so much trouble between her boys lately, he would spend the night sorting them to drive away the bad spirits. It was her way of calling him a bad spirit. He couldn't blame her. If he had 2 sons fighting over another man, he'd be furious too. The fault lay with Caleb and Wyatt. But as always, he was the one who suffered the consequences. He looked at the mountain of beans and felt a piece of him die. There would be no sleep tonight. He sighed, but then remembered that it was Ma Miller who had saved him from starvation. For that kindness, he respected her. If this task would appease her anger, he would do it. He told her not to worry, that he would finish. Ma Miller, who had been about to say more, simply nodded and went to her room. After this, he knew it would be time to leave the Miller house for good. He worked through the night, and by the time the sun rose, the beans were sorted. His legs were so numb from crouching that he couldn't stand. When Ma Miller came out and saw his pale, exhausted face, a flicker of pity crossed her features. She sighed softly and told him to go rest, that he wouldn't have to work that day. Julian stopped her before she could leave, asking if she had come to send him away. She paused. He knew she had wanted to for months but could never bring herself to do it. She was a strong, proud woman who had raised 2 sons and taken in 2 strays all on her own by running the butcher shop after her husband died. He didn't want to make things harder for her. He told her that his leaving was the best solution, wasn't it? She had no answer. He gave her a weak smile and assured her he wouldn't starve. She finally nodded, and he went to gather his belongings. He had little to his name, just 2 changes of clothes that barely filled a small satchel. He took out the silver dollar Silas had given him and left it on the small table in the room. The Miller brothers were in town, so his departure would be unimpeded. Once free of the house, he ran. He ran toward the woods, toward Silas, toward a life where he imagined he would eat meat every day.
的苦日子到头了。
The hard days were over. He was laughing when he collided with a chest as solid as an oak tree. He skidded to a halt just in time to save his nose from being broken. A warm voice asked if he was hurt, and he looked up to see Silas. Forgetting they were on a public path, Julian leaped into his arms, wrapping his legs around Silas's waist and his arms around his neck. He was free. Silas's smile was like the warm sun, and Julian, dizzy with relief, leaned in and kissed him. The hunter's body went rigid, and the gentle look in his eyes turned to a burning intensity. He pulled Julian off him, swung him over his shoulder in one smooth motion, and started walking. He said Julian must be hungry, and that they were going home. His stride was fast, and Julian bounced with every step, the hard muscle of Silas's shoulder pressing into his stomach. A strange sense of apprehension began to creep in. The moment they were inside the cabin, Silas slammed the door and pressed him against it. Before Julian could process what was happening, a tongue was in his mouth, turning his world upside down. He pushed with all his might, but Silas was immovable. His clothes were torn open, and a calloused hand roamed his body, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. When Silas's mouth found a particularly sensitive spot, a jolt of pleasure shot through him, robbing him of the strength to protest. He surrendered, ready for whatever came next. But before anything could truly begin, his mind grew foggy. The pleasure was so intense it was making him lose consciousness. He felt a light slapping on his cheek and heard Silas's voice calling his name, telling him to wake up. Mumbling for him to stop, that he was tired, Julian swatted a hand away and fell into a deep sleep. He woke in the late afternoon. His gaze met Silas's. He saw that one side of the hunter's face was swollen and realized with dawning horror that he had fallen asleep in the middle of their encounter. He checked under the blankets. There were marks on his skin, but his ultimate sanctity was intact. He gave an awkward laugh, explaining that he hadn't slept all night and was just too exhausted. Silas handed him a bowl of rich meat stew, telling him to eat up. He needed his strength for the night ahead. Julian's heart sank. This man was relentless. He defiantly ate 3 bowls, a final meal to commemorate his impending doom. Silas was true to his word. As soon as darkness fell, he was insatiable. Julian's pleas for mercy went unheeded. He desperately wished he could pass out again, but he had slept too much during the day. No matter how exhausted his body became, his mind remained stubbornly awake. Silas kissed his eyelids, asking if he was still hungry. Seeing the look in his eyes, Julian scrambled away, insisting he was full. Silas chuckled, pulled him back, and playfully pressed on his full belly. It was 3 days before Julian could walk properly again. Silas was out hunting, leaving him alone. He limped around the small yard, cursing all men with every painful step. In a corner of the yard, he noticed a few unfamiliar plants growing vigorously. They were small, with delicate white and purple flowers. They looked vaguely familiar, like the experimental potato sprouts his older brother, a botanist, had once cultivated in his lab. And next to them were tall stalks that looked remarkably like corn. As far as he knew, these plants shouldn't exist in this era. But he dismissed it as his own ignorance. As he tried to stand, a sharp pain shot through his back, and he nearly fell. A pair of strong hands caught him, pulling him into a familiar embrace. He started to curse Silas for a beast, but the words died in his throat. The man holding him was Caleb. His face was grim. He asked if this was the choice Julian had made after leaving. Julian pushed him away and stood on his own, acknowledging him coolly. Caleb remained silent, his intense gaze making Julian's skin crawl. Finally, they both spoke at the same time. Caleb said he knew his mother had forced Julian out and that he could take him back. Julian, relieved, shook his head. He said that no one had forced him, that this was his own choice. Just then, Wyatt stormed into the yard, grabbing Julian's arm and telling him to come back. His grip was like iron, and Julian couldn't break free. He bit down hard on Wyatt's hand. The younger man didn't let go. His eyes just stared, red-rimmed and furious, until blood started to flow. Only then did he release his grip. Julian looked from Wyatt to Caleb. He told them both to wake up, that whatever had existed between them was over. In a fit of rage, Wyatt broke his own lip with his teeth and swung a fist at Julian. Julian flinched, closing his eyes, but instead of impact, he heard a dull thud. He opened his eyes to see Wyatt's fist buried in the wooden wall of the cabin, blood dripping from his knuckles. The 3 of them stood in silence. Julian told Caleb to take his brother and leave. Caleb's lips trembled, and after a long moment, he managed a hoarse, "All right." After they were gone, Julian poured a glass of water to steady his nerves. As he took a sip, Silas burst in, pulling him into a frantic embrace. Startled, Julian slapped him across the face. Silas just stared at him, a wounded look in his eyes, before breaking into a wide grin. He was just so happy Julian hadn't left. Julian's anger melted when he saw a dark stain on Silas's shoulder. He anxiously checked the injury, asking how he'd gotten hurt. Silas laughed, explaining it was dear blood, not his. He had seen the Miller brothers leaving as he returned and had dropped his kill to run back to the cabin. That night, Silas cooked a feast of venison, telling Julian it was all to build up his strength. Julian rolled his eyes, knowing it was Silas who would benefit from his renewed vigor. But to his surprise, Silas was gentle for the next few days, allowing him to recover. Julian was comfortable, but Silas seemed to be going stir-crazy. Julian often heard him muttering to himself in the yard at night, crouching by his strange plants, saying things were growing well. One night, after hearing this for the 18th time, Julian decided to act. When Silas slipped out of bed to go to the yard, Julian hooked a leg around his waist and invited him back to bed, telling him to stop acting like a nervous old woman. Silas, though surprised, readily accepted the invitation. Yet, later that night he was back in the yard, whispering to his plants. Julian became convinced Silas was seeing someone else. The next night he lay in wait. He put on his most revealing nightshirt, but when Silas pounced, Julian kicked him away, insisting he wasn't in the mood. He was determined to catch the homewrecker. Silas, looking like a dejected puppy, curled up in a corner. Julian waited, and eventually fell asleep. He was awoken by Silas's muttering from the yard. The intruder was still there. He grabbed the wood-chopping axe from beside the door and stormed outside, ready to confront his rival. But the yard was empty, save for Silas, who was watering his strange green plants. He must have just missed them. As he started to give chase, Silas grabbed him, asking what he was doing out in the cold. Suddenly, Julian's frustration turned to tears. He accused Silas of cheating on him so soon after they had gotten together. Silas looked bewildered but held him close, earnestly denying it. He swore there was no one else, that no one could compare to Julian. Julian's sobs grew louder, punctuated by an embarrassing hiccup and a large bubble of snot. Silas, with a sigh of resignation, finally explained. He wasn't talking to a person, he was talking to a program. He revealed that he and Julian were not from this time. Silas was, in fact, the very rival Julian had despised back home. On Julian's 20th birthday, Silas had crashed his party. An argument had led to a tumble down a flight of stairs, a bizarre accidental kiss, and then this. Silas had been linked to a device that had transported them here. His mission was to cultivate genetically superior, drought-resistant crops from seeds provided by the device. Success would solve the famine and send them home. Julian stared at him, furious. It was all his fault. If he hadn't shown up, they never would have fallen. Then he demanded to know the specifics of Silas's mission. A faint blush crept up Silas's cheeks. He said he would explain that later. With that, he scooped Julian up and carried him back inside. 6 months later, the crops were a resounding success. Silas presented the seeds to a government agent, and within a year, the new crops had been planted across the country, ending the Great Famine. Their mission complete, the device activated, and they were pulled back home. Julian awoke in a hospital bed, his parents and brothers surrounding him. The relief was so overwhelming that he burst into tears, clinging to his family after so long and after so much hardship. His first question was about Silas. His older brother smirked, assuring him that Silas would be fine. They had used the full force of their company's new technology to retrieve them. His second brother added that he'd even given Silas some of his best bred seeds to help. Julian felt a pang of annoyance. Why couldn't he have gotten the fancy device? He could have been a hero. His brother just rapped him on the forehead, reminding him he could barely keep a houseplant alive. Silas woke up 3 days later. Julian had been waiting by his bedside. The moment his eyes opened, relief flooded Julian's heart. He was about to make a joke about him being a lazy pig when Silas pulled him into a fierce hug. His voice thick with emotion as he said how glad he was that Julian was safe. Julian pushed him away, putting on a haughty air. He reminded Silas that they were in the modern world now, and they were rivals. He warned him not to try anything, or his brothers would deal with him. Unless, he added, Silas finally told him what his secret mission was. Silas just laughed. "I told you," he said. "We can discuss that later." Julian scowled at the clever wordplay. Then he told Silas he was never to call him by his old nickname again. It was too suggestive. "What if I want to?" Silas asked, a playful glint in his eye. "Then I'll change my name," Julian shot back. He turned to look out the window. The sun was warm. A gentle breeze was blowing. It was a perfect day.